So now we're starting to see the pattern that polygyny was not outlawed by the Creator. It was not outlawed by the Messiah. It was outlawed by Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. So right now we were just focusing on the church to show you how this has affected us today, because our ancestors were slaves. We saw, as I pointed out, what the rules was to institute Catholic doctrine into the slaves. That's what's supposed to have been taught, was Catholic doctrine to the slaves. And so this was the Roman Catholic Church, but now we're about to go back a little more and just get into Rome in general and see what does history state about Rome in general concerning monogamy and polygyny. All right. So this first one that we're going to get into right here is from the Yale Law Journal, 1907. All right. It's called Marriage in Roman Law, page 320. It was forbidden to have several concubines at once. This would have been polygamy, contrary to Roman civilization. Likewise, a man having a lawful wife could not take a concubine. This would have been adultery and bigamy. If any audacious debauchee violated this law, public morality protested against such turpitude. That is, once again, the Yale Law Journal from 1907. All right, so let's see what polygamy.com has to say about it. They're putting stuff out there. They're advocates for it. Let's see what their views are. The history of polygamy dates back to a long time ago, since this have been practiced for many centuries by cultures from all over the world. The Hebrew society has partially accepted polygamy, and there are traces that say that it happened in classical China too. The polygamy was widely accepted throughout the world until the Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church has imposed the rules of having just one wife, but multiple other lovers were the norm. We're actually going to get into that later. The polygamy was widely accepted during the last 2,000 years in sub-Saharan Africa also. And do you know who was in the locations of sub-Saharan Africa? That's right, the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people. Let's continue. So this next one is a excerpt from Wikipedia. I know you're probably like, oh, Wikipedia, that's not a trusted source. That's more trusted than some of the stuff that you guys say. But nevertheless, I use Wikipedia to get a general idea. But what I really use it for is that when you go down to the bottom of the page, what a lot of people don't like to go to, they have all their sources cited. They have all the references. So I find a lot of literature by going to the references, because they're not just, although it's a quote unquote open source, they're citing references from where they're getting certain things from. So I look into that. And so here's something that is stated on that page. Marriage in ancient Rome was a strictly monogamous institution. A Roman citizen by law could have only one spouse at a time. The practice of monogamy distinguished the Greeks and Romans from other ancient civilizations in which elite males typically had multiple wives. The same institution that outlawed the holy days, changed the Ten Commandments, told us we didn't have to keep the law, changed the Sabbath, whose religion was imposed on us by enslavement, is the same institution that forcibly outlawed our ancestors' custom of polygyny. And this is important to note, because you need to know why some of us are so angry concerning this topic. I mean, this is deep-seated Catholic doctrine that is rising up, unaware to the Hebrew man or woman. You just don't know it's there. So this next book that I'm going to reference is actually the IVP Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of commentaries, because most commentaries are trash. It's full of doctrinal biases, and I don't want that in my life. I just want the information. Let me see what the discoveries are, and let me process it. That's what I want. I don't want your opinion. I don't want what conclusions you came to. Just give me the data, give me the information, and let me process it. All right. So one thing I like about this commentary, this specific one here, is I'm going to read this little brown area on the cover that's on the screen. It says, an indispensable resource for all students of the Bible, accessibly providing the cultural background of every passage of the Old Testament. So this is just giving information. That's all it's doing. I even read the introduction and the preface, and it's really saying, it's like, yo, what are some people going to do with this information? They basically like, they don't know. I mean, whatever maybe it's not useful to some people, maybe it is useful. They're just providing it because it's not accessible to the layman. So these people who produce this type of work, where it's just, here's the information, here's the data, do what you want with it. Even though they may have biases, it don't bleed off into what they are presenting as often as it would if you go into the New Testament. You go into the New Testament, any commentary in the New Testament, that stuff, I haven't seen one that's good yet, because that just becomes a cesspool of religiosity right there. I can't deal with any commentary on the New Testament, but people are pretty solid when on the Old Testament, because they just state what it is. Partly because they believe that Jesus came and changed all of that. So it's easy to say, yeah, well, this is just what it is. But when you get to the new covenant, it's not the same because Jesus changed it. So they get to live in this fantasy world. So they don't fully understand the context of that. And that's that emotionalism that is intertwined between doctrine. But nevertheless, I'm going to reference this in this lesson and also in my next lesson, because it has some really good information. So this is what it says about polygamy. The practice of polygamy, the practice of a man marrying more than one wife is known as polygamy. The custom was based on several factors. Number one, an imbalance in the number of males and females. Number two, the need to produce large numbers of children to work the herds and or fields. Number three, the desire to increase the prestige and wealth of a household through multiple marriage contracts. And four, the high rate of death of females in childbirth. Polygamy was most common among pastoral nomadic groups and in rural farming communities, where it is important that every female be attached to a household and be productive. Monarchs also practiced polygamy primarily as a means of making alliances with powerful families in other nations. And that's where a lot of the religious folk who look at Solomon like, oh, he was lustful, don't understand what Solomon was doing. But don't worry, I'm going to address that in the next lesson. But that's very key. But you got to understand culture. You got to understand what was actually going on behind the scenes, the cultural context. But I want to read that again. Polygamy was most common among pastoral, nomadic groups and in rural farming communities, where it was important that every female be attached to a household and be productive. What group of people were pastoral, nomadic, and in rural farming communities, and definitely felt that it was important to have every female attached to a household and be productive? Sounds like the Hebrew people to me. Sounds like the Hebrew people. But let's continue. So this next one is a excerpt of a book, which I'm going to reference later, but the way I did the slides, I didn't have it up here, so it'll show up later. But it's about monogamy and polygyny. The abstract, it says, this paper discusses Greco-Roman practices of monogamy and polygyny for a forthcoming handbook on the ancient family. I do have that handbook of on Roman ancient family, and like I said, I'm going to address that later. It's a little bit that's in there, but he comes out the gate swinging with a lot of cold hard facts. All right, so let's start off and let's read what it says. Why Greco-Roman monogamy matters. Now, I want to say this. One thing I like about anyone who can present scholarly information, I respect them if they can leave their own opinions out of it. A lot of these things, whether it's a commentary, whether it's a work of a scholar, they still may have their views on some of this stuff. Like when I read all this stuff, he's presenting a lot of information and everything that he presented, but he still believes that Greco-Roman heritage is something to be proud of. So this isn't a Hebrew man trying to get some people to believe in polygyny so that he could get more wives. This is a European who is writing about history, trying to come to a conclusion on something while displaying facts, but still believing that Greco-Roman heritage is something to be proud of. But that's fine. You can believe that all you want. As long as you provide me with the data, I can make my own decision on what I view about Roman Greco-monogamy. But here we go. To a modern Western audience, the fact that ancient Greeks and Romans were not supposed to be married to more than one person at any given time, nor even cohabit with others alongside legal spouses, must seem perfectly normal. This may explain why this practice has been received This may explain why this practice has hardly received any attention from historians of the classical world. Yet, from a global, cross-cultural perspective, there is nothing normal or unremarkable about this. Instead, until very recently, polygynous arrangements of marriage or cohabitation were the norm in world history, and strict monogamy remained an exception. Barely 1 in 6 of the 1,195 societies surveyed in the largest anthropological dataset has been classified as monogamous, while polygyny was frequently considered the preferred choice, even if it failed to be in common practice. Small examples of better documented societies convey a similar picture, and while monogamy is observed in a small proportion of all cases, due to their failure to distinguish between rare instances of polygamy and its formal prohibition, these surveys tend to overestimate the actual incidence of strictly monogamous rules. In fact, although the nature of the evidence does not allow us to rule out the existence of strictly monogamous systems prior to the first millennium BCE, the earliest unequivocal documentation originates from the archaic Greek and early Roman periods. Thus, even though Greeks and Romans need not have been the first cultures to prescribe monogamy, these are the earliest securely attested cases, and moreover established a paradigm for subsequent periods that eventually attained global dominance. In this sense, Greco-Roman monogamy may well be the single most important phenomenon of ancient history that has remained widely unrecognized. What is more, the global positive correlation between patricentric kinship systems and polygyny renders the emergence of prescriptive monogamy in the patricentric societies of Greece and Rome even more remarkable. So he said a lot right there, but he goes on to say a couple more things that I think is important to highlight, especially seeing how it impacted then and how that residual impacts now. He says, Greek and Roman societies occupy an intermediate and, retrospectively speaking, transitional position on this spectrum, one that might be labeled polygynous monogamy, shunning multiple marriage and discouraging informal parallel cohabitation such as concubinage within marriage. Their system readily accommodated multiple sexual relations for married men, though not for women, with most notably through sexual access to slaves of either sex. So that's important. Why is that important? I'll tell you in just a moment, but let me continue. It is worth noting that the evolution of Greek monogamy coincided with the expansion of chattel slavery, which provided a socially acceptable arena for extramarital sexual activity and male reproductive inequality. Sex with slaves had a long pedigree in the ancient Near East, but arguably assumed a special significance under the formal constraints of socially imposed monogamy. It's interesting how they referenced it earlier as polygamous monogamy, because although they subscribed to only having one wife, and yes, you couldn't have a concubine, they were perfectly fine with you having sex. And I'm speaking of the Greco-Roman era, especially in Rome. They were perfectly fine with you having sex with your slaves, whether male or female. We're perfectly fine with you doing that. And you have to think about how this mindset had trickled down, follow the road, right? So we know all roads lead to Rome, but if we go back the opposite way from those roads that splinter away from Rome, you come back here to America through the transatlantic slave trade, and we can see the effects of that same mentality. All right, so it often speaks about how they subscribed to monogamy, but sex with slaves were permissible. And think about how that same mentality trickled down for centuries and ended up with us in the land of our captivity, where slave masters repeatedly had sex with the black slave women and created bastard slave children at the time of conception. All right, they had no interest in raising these children. Matter of fact, some of the research says that they were even feeding the babies to alligators as gator bait. So this is some very sick, sadistic stuff that was going on here. These were the originators of the deadbeat daddy, right? So they make fun of, or they poke fun at the fact that black men don't take care of children, quote unquote, right? But they originated that concept here in America. They were the initial deadbeat daddies. But before I go on a rant on that, let me focus on my point that I'm trying to get across. So prescriptive monogamy, as they coined it, remained a defining feature of being Greek. However, sex with slaves were allowed. Concubines were allowed for a time, but they had to be outside of the home. So that was for a time. Homosexual was allowed and was common. Pedophilia occurred, but having multiple wives were prohibited. This sounds just like America, where it's okay to have freelance sex as long as you follow the socially acceptable methods of doing so. As long as you're within that, everything is okay. So polygyny is frowned upon, but yet these other elements has been or are fine here in America. So you have to ask yourself, where do you get your views on polygyny? Many of you get them from the oppressor. They have been passed on to you from those who were in power way back when in Rome. I have a few more slides. We're almost done. So as I stated earlier when I was referencing the book on commentary, I'm pretty cool with scholars addressing the Old Testament because they're usually pretty solid, and I think that has something to do with the language. When you study the language, when you understand the language, it can help you understand how the people moved, how they operated, what their culture was really like. When you start getting into the New Testament, as I said, you sprinkle a little Jesus in there, you sprinkle some Greek thought and some Greek language, and then you just get this whole explosion of doctrine, of spiritualness, of just assertions, and just it just becomes messy. And so for the sake of being intellectually honest, I'm going to read everything on this entire slide so it doesn't appear that I'm picking and choosing, although I don't agree with some of the things that's stated specifically in the middle of the slide. However, once again, I'm going to read it for the sake of being honest. As both the notion of civic rights and the institution of chattel slavery declined in the Greco-Roman world of the later Roman Empire, Christianity maintained and reinforced monogamous norms. The canonical New Testament tradition has Jesus take sides in Jewish debates about the propriety of divorce in a way that implies rejection of any non-monogamous practices. Once again, I'll address stuff like this in my rebuttals lesson, which is the next lesson. But let me continue. The Qumran movement likewise opposed polygyny, which is true. Pauline doctrine, however, fails to explicitly address the issue. That is also true. Later church fathers saw fit to explain away Old Testament polygamy as motivated by God's command to populate the world, an expansion that was no longer necessary or desirable. However, monogamy per se does not play a central role in early Christian writings, and the fact that Augustine labeled it a Roman custom indicates that Christianity may simply have appropriated it as an element of mainstream Greco-Roman culture. And the last slide from this book reads, under these circumstances, Greco-Roman style prescriptive monogamy found itself in a precarious position, and its eventual expansion as a Christian institution was by no means a foregone conclusion. The unfolding of this drawn-out process is well beyond the remit of this chapter. Suffice it to say that the very considerable normative power of monogamy within Christianity is highlighted by the fact that sectarian polygamy among the Anabaptists and the Munster in the early 16th century and the first generations of the Mormons remained a sporadic fringe phenomenon. In recent centuries, Western-style prescriptive monogamy achieved global reach through endemic diffusion and acculturation, with the areas least affected by European influence, the Middle East and tropical Africa, showing the greatest resilience of polygamous preference. Before I read this last sentence, let's really pay attention to what's being said there. It's saying that acculturation, which, and I think I have that on my next slide. But what acculturation is basically when one culture comes in contact with another culture, and that dominant culture pretty much imposes itself in the lower culture, the one that's under that one, basically begins to accept. Most of the time forcibly, but they basically begins to accept what is being stated or being proposed. So it begins to they begin to assimilate in a way to the dominant culture. So that's what acculturation is, when a dominant culture begins to subjugate a lower culture. So you add that, and then it says, with the areas least affected by European influence, and the Middle East and tropical Africa showing the greatest resilience of polygamous preference. So you see the areas that did not have the greatest Christian influence, according to what this person is, according to the author, the places that does not have the greatest Christian influence are still polygynous. They're still polygynous. We look at West Africa today, they still practice polygyny, although some of the people who were there are now starting to subscribe to monogamy, or they're at least starting to have widespread issues because the men are still attempting to be polygynous and the women want them to be monogamous. But all of that is because they're Christians. So that Christian thought has come into these tribes, these tribal people, and begin to that process of acculturation happens, that assimilation to a more dominant culture. These type of things begin to occur, and people begin to lose their actual culture. But that doesn't mean something from the divine has changed anything. That just says that some other culture has overtaken a lesser culture. All right. So the developments, back to the slide, the developments can ultimately be traced back to Greek and Roman conventions and form an element out of our Greco-Roman heritage that deserves a far more prominent status in our historical consciousness than it has so far achieved. Notice that the writer says our Greco-Roman heritage. So who is he writing to? He's not writing to us. He's not writing to melanated men and women. He's not writing to us. So once again, this author has his own worldview, but he did put out a lot of good stuff for us to be able to look at, analyze, and digest. So I'm going to read that again. These developments can ultimately be traced back to Greek and Roman conventions. What? Monogamy. Monogamy can be traced back to Greek and Roman conventions and form an element of our Greco-Roman heritage that deserves a far more prominent status in our historical consciousness than it has so far achieved. So here's a little bit of about acculturation so that you can have a clearer understanding of what that means. It is the process of changing artifacts, customs, and beliefs that result from the contact of two or more cultures. The term is used to refer the results of such changes. Two major types of acculturation, incorporation and directed change, may be distinguished on the basis of conditions under which cultural contact and the change take place. Incorporation refers to the free borrowing and modification of cultural elements and occurs when people of different cultures maintain contact as well as political and social self-determination. In contrast, pay attention, directed change occurs when one group establishes dominance over another through military conquest or political control. I'm gonna skip down to the bottom of this because this is important to highlight and I need to wrap this up. The processes that operate under conditions of directed change, which is really how we ended up accepting this whole monogamous thing as being the norm and being the only way. The process that operate under conditions of directed change include forced assimilation, the complete replacement of one culture by another, and resistance against aspects of the dominant culture. Let me read that again. The processes that operate under conditions of directed change, this is the second way that this occurs, that acculturation occurs, include forced assimilation, the complete replacement of one culture by another, and resistance against aspects of the dominant culture. If you're not able to see what has happened to us at this point, it's really because you really are resisting and you really don't want to. This isn't about, okay, I'll present this lesson now, you all should go start a polygynous relationship. That's not what I'm saying. It's just accepting truth for what it is. You're a Hebrew, you subscribe to this book, but you deny and you slander people because of their views on this. It's getting out of hand. All right, so let's continue. This is about Emperor Justinian. So it reads, Roman marriage rules were conterminous with the sway of Roman law. Diverging customs prevailed more in peripheral parts of the Roman Empire. The Jewish polygamous tradition can be traced back to the Old Testament. Josephus refers to our ancestral custom that a man may have several wives at the same time, and that is from Antiquities. While the overall scale of this practice in the Roman period cannot be ascertained, actual cases of bigamy were reported, and the rabbinic texts repeatedly mention plural unions and do not normally disapprove of them as long as they were undertaken for honorable reasons. The fact that as late as 393 CE, the Roman state had to forbid Jews to enter into several matrimonies at the same time underscores the persistence of this custom. So this is well after the Messiah. This custom was still being practiced, much to the disdain of the Roman Empire. 534 CE, Emperor Justinian, in his digest, 48.8.11, circumcision was allowed only for Jews by birth, but prohibited for proselytes and slaves. Judaism ceased to be a permitted religion, although some Jewish practices were still allowed. The purpose of this and other legislation was to induce Jews to convert to Christianity and to show Christians the superiority of the church over the synagogue. Meanwhile, conversion to Judaism was punishable by death and confiscation of the offender's goods. Jews who stoned Jewish converts to Christianity were condemned to be burned alive, and, catch this, Jewish law could not be applied in matters of matrimony. Once again, this is the Roman Empire. We bounced back. We started off with the Roman Empire. First of all, we started off in America with the Roman our government, which essentially is the Roman government. Then we start looking at the Roman Catholic Church. Then we bounced back to Rome, and now we are back at the Roman Catholic Church laying down the law on Hebrews, on Israelites, to prevent them from living out their own customs. All right, so this is the medieval source book. This is a legislation affecting the Jews from 300 to 800 CE. I'm not going to read all of it. There was a lot of legislations during this time. As a matter of fact, if you look at that link that's at the bottom, you will see that there's different rulers or different people who were in charge at different times imposed different rules. I selected this because this was the most clearest form or clearest language that I can find from all of them. That's basically saying you cannot live the way you want to live. You cannot live according to your own customs. All right. So of course I'm going to read the two sentences that's in red. I'm not going to read all of it. If you want to know what all of it says, you can pause the screen, read it, write it down. But I'm only going to focus on the two red points, which reads, practice of Jewish customs to be punished. And the second one, marriage to be according to Christian customs. So once again, this is another document showing how the Roman Catholic Church was trying to regulate what it was that we were doing, what it was as far as us living out our own culture and customs. And eventually they won, because now we're here in America, and the vast majority of the population, whether they are if they are aware of their Hebrew origins, or if they're just a black man and woman, they think that monogamy is the standard, and they think that polygyny is wrong. They think that it's a sin. They think that it's lustful. They have all these negative connotations to it. So in the end, yes, the Roman Catholic Church won. Rome got the whole world to see things their way, but not in its entirety, because there are still people in the peripheral. There are still tribes. There are still countries who still understand that this is natural law. We Hebrews understand it as this is part of our covenant. So you have Josephus pointing out that it was our ancestral custom that a man have several wives at the same time. But then you have the Roman Empire saying the practice of Jewish customs to be punished and marriage to be according to Christian customs. So at least be honest with yourself and understand that when you oppose it, this is not about you deciding to live it or not. When you oppose it, you are propagating Catholic doctrine. I've proved that. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, it has been very clear through all of the sources that if you are in opposition of it as being lawful, if you are in opposition of it being practiced, you are propagating Catholic doctrine. But let's continue. I think I got one more slide left. So here's another book from a Christian author. Once again, this book is very much Christian. Very much opposes polygyny, polygamy, however you want to reference it. They're in opposition of it, but they don't care. They're still writing where this stuff comes from. They're still writing what happened in the past. See, I can accept this because it's not doctrine. This is just what it is. This is just what it is. And that's how we have to be, and that's how we have to approach this. This is just what it is. All right? It reads, when the Christian church came into being, polygamy was still practiced by the Jews. It is true that we find no references to it in the New Testament. And from this, some have inferred that it must have fallen into disuse, and that at the time of our Lord, the Jewish people had become monogamous. But the conclusion appears to be unwarranted. Josephus in two places speaks of polygamy as a recognized institution, and Justin Martyr makes it a matter of reproach to Trypho that the Jewish teachers permitted a man to have several wives. Indeed, when in 212 AD, the Lex Antiana de Civitate gave the rights of Roman citizenship to a great number of Jews, it was found necessary to tolerate polygamy among them, even though it was against Roman law for a citizen to have more than one wife. Let me read that again. Even though it was against Roman law for a citizen to have more than one wife. In 285 AD, a constitution of Domitian and Maximian interdicted, that means prohibited, polygamy to all subjects of the empire without exception. But with the Jews, at least the enactment failed of its effect. And in 393 AD, a special law was issued by Theodosius to compel the Jews to relinquish the national custom. Even so, they were not induced to conform. So why weren't they able to stop it? Is it simply because the men throughout history, starting with Jacob, and I'm speaking of the Hebrew lineage, the Israelite lineage, starting with Jacob, is that all of them was just lustful? All the men were just lustful, on down to this point? Because you look through the text and we were never sent into captivity for polygyny. We were sent there for idolatry. We weren't sent there for polygyny. So why couldn't they stop it? It's because no one wants to have someone else superimpose their beliefs onto them. You have now awakened to your heritage. You don't want any Christian superimposing what he believes onto you and holding you accountable to what he interprets as good and evil. We look at this in America right now. What America calls good, we see it as evil. What they call evil, we see it as good. So if in their eyes it is lawful according to their covenant and their ancestral customs, and that they are not in sin with their creator, with their tribal deity, and they are not in sin by doing so, who are you to tell us we can't do this? And also, they were told, even when in captivity, as in Jeremiah tells you, to continue to have children, continue to multiply. And the most efficient way of doing so is polygyny. Besides the fact it's lawful. And the Roman Catholic Church only wanted us to be Christians to begin with. So they tried to use what they can, and eventually they weaponized doctrine. And if you did these things, you would die. But anytime you use fear to sway someone into doing something, the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to do it when you're not looking. They're going to do it when you're not around. You're not going to stop them from actually doing it. So consider what it is, the information that I brought forward when it comes to this lesson. And meditate, digest it. I presented a lot of information today. From my perspective, there's no way you can walk away from this lesson and say, nope, the Messiah changed that. There's no way you can walk away from this lesson and say anything other than monogamy as we know it, as the sole and most popular form of marriage, is a Roman custom. There's no way that you can view this any other way with all of the information I just presented. This is not saying monogamy did not exist in other times. It did. But to think that polygyny was something that only a very small population of people were doing, I mean, this here shows you. So we can't even continue to use the claim that it was only for royal men, it was only for kings, it was only for... No, history says something different, because where was all these kings and royal men when the Roman Catholic Church was imposing these rules? Where were they? They wasn't there. We didn't have a king. But they kept performing this for century after century after century, and the Roman Catholic doctrine was trying to impose them to stop century after century after century. So just accept what it is. The Creator saw this as good, which is why He birthed the nation out of it, His chosen people. That's all I got. Part 3 will be coming. That is going to address some rebuttals. And once again, I hope this was edifying for you. I hope you were able to take something out of this, digest it, and really consider where your thoughts come from. I am Moray Amir Ryder. Peace and shalom.